Leonie has completed more than 400 research and consulting assignments for government, semi-government, private, and not-for-profit clients in more than 40 countries across the globe. She has delivered more than 100 articles, papers, and talks for South African, African, and global audiences, and has edited more than 100 articles for online and offline publications, including conference papers and research articles in international academic journals. Leonie has a legendary commitment to professional excellence and an unwavering passion for quality, ethical standards, and sustainable interventions. Leonie also runs her own online survey platform and is launching a survey interviewer program across Africa. And I believe she might be demoing some of this to us today. And today she will be talking to us about survey research. Survey research, for those who don't know yet, is one of the ways that we as researchers collect information and ask for answers to specific questions from a selection of people. Information from survey research allows researchers to understand, interpret, and even change the world. Now, more than ever, information from the Global South should be shared to ensure justice, equality, and equity for all forms of knowledge. This is especially problematic with AI models currently being trained and tested primarily from information gained from the Global North. Collecting and sharing information that represents a plurality of bodies is therefore imperative. In this webinar, Leonie's focus will be on using survey interviewing to create quality data. We will learn about the role of the interviewer, how to ask great questions, how to deal with bias, a practical system to apply during survey interviews, examples of do's and don'ts for survey interviewing, and the ethical principles to adhere to make sure that the credibility of your research is not compromised. Thank you again, Leonie, for doing this for us, and we are really privileged to be learning from you today.
Thank you very much for the introduction and welcome everyone. This time of the year, it's a crazy time of the year, so I'm humbled that you managed to join me today in this session. I'm going to start with why interviewing is important at all, but good research helps us to achieve better services and better service delivery. It helps us to achieve more efficient use of resources and also to improve social development, to improve access to information, which is becoming even more and more important. It can lead to higher individual productivity, improved planning by governments. There's a whole list of things that make it important for us to be able to do survey interviewing. I'm going to cover 4 key things in the presentation, or the components. The first being why survey interviewing, the secondly, who does survey interviewing, thirdly, what it is, and lastly, how to do it, but also how not to do it, because there are some important points about how not to be doing survey interviewing. The information from survey research actually allows researchers to understand and interpret and even change the world. You might be wondering, seeing as AI is on all our minds, why we still want to do survey interviewing. Because someone said to me the other day, isn't AI going to give us all the answers? So here's the thing. The lifeblood of AI is actually data. And without data, AI cannot be trained to interpret questions and to give answers, and it cannot be tested to see how well it's doing when answering questions. So most of the AI software platforms are actually approaching people to do surveys for information that they can use, and they're actually contacting research organizations who supply data to buy the data from them. But at the moment, the AI models are trained and tested primarily based on information from the global north. And so it's more important for us, it's most important for us actually at the moment to share information from the global south. Um, and there exists a plurality of knowledge, and these different forms of knowledge have the right to actually coexist in dialogue outside any hierarchical framework of dependence or superiority or inferiority. And so collecting and sharing information that represents that plurality of bodies of knowledge is actually imperative. And it's more imperative now than it has ever been, given the vibes that AI is sending out. So collecting information and sharing information that represents the plurality of knowledge requires some work. So when we're looking at who to do that work, one of the ways is to actually collect information directly from people. And so the role of the interviewer in that process is very important. A survey research interview is a planned conversation for the purpose of gathering accurate information about a research topic or an area of investigation or whatever we're interested in. So it's one of the most personal ways that we can collect information. On the one side, the interviewer, who should be a very good communicator, um, the interviewer asks questions and manages the process and the flow of the interview to learn about and understand the perspective of the research participant. So it's not a one-sided process though. And so on the other side, we have the person being interviewed, and that person is often referred to as either a respondent or a participant, or in the worst case scenario, some people call them data subjects in line with the poppy wording. So the research participant responds to the questions that the interviewer asks, and that's a bit self-explanatory. But we collect a whole host of information from people. So we ask about their behavior, we ask about their characteristics, their opinions, their perspectives, their thoughts, their experiences, their feelings. Um, but the ultimate aim of it is to create quality data. And quality data means that researchers are able to measure things, to interpret findings accurately. If the data is not quality, we can't do that. It also provides a foundation for future research. And if the quality isn't good, that foundation will crumble over time. And lastly, it gives credibility to research, and it helps to grow people, to grow products, to grow services and organizations. None of that will happen if there isn't quality data, with or without AI. So quality, when I say quality, I mean accurate information. I mean complete information, making sure that we have all the information we need. Consistent information. So irrespective of where we ask people, or how we ask them, that information is consistent and reliable. Information must be timely. So the relevance of the data, and it must be up to date, and it must be relevant for the context. Someone showed me an example of using AI to ask where to go on holiday, and depending on the language that the person used, they got very different answers of where they should be going on holiday, which seems uh, appropriate. However, it's also quite biased. The conformance of data to rules and constraints is also very important because that impacts on the validity. And lastly, in terms of relevance, ensuring that the data is relevant to the objectives of the research. And all of those things determine what quality means in survey interviewing. So looking at a more practical system of how we go about it, and obviously we can't in an hour cover the entire everything that has to be covered ever. But this process works very well practically. Remember that you are asking participants for their time, their attention, their trust, and their personal information. So thank them at the beginning and at the end. Um, and I can't stress that enough. We sometimes, if you're doing interviews, you get very involved in what it is that you want out of the interview. But it is ultimately a conversation with a person, and they are doing you a favor. So be sensitive to their needs and look for any signs that they are uncomfortable. We sometimes kind of look at the questions we have to ask, we forget to look at the person, so that we can address discomfort. So if the person looks uncomfortable, address it. And always treat them with unconditional respect and acceptance. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Step one, who are you? So introduce yourself and the organization. If you're working with an organization or for an organization or collecting the information on behalf of an organization, tell them who that is. So start a friendly but professional conversation. Introduce yourself. Secondly, introduce the research. So you know what the research is that you're doing, but this person probably has very little information about that. So explain the purpose of the interviews and the importance of their participation. But keep it brief. You don't have to share your passion for the field that you're doing the research in its entirety. So I always say to people, keep the research introduction to 25 words or less. Then explain the format of the interview. You have to always mention the expected duration of the interview so that the person actually knows what to expect and how long they will be if you haven't mentioned it before. Then informed consent. You cannot proceed with the interview without informed consent. So once you've given a little bit of background, told them who you are and what it will involve from them, you can then obtain their informed consent for the interview. You have to explain how the interview data will be recorded, what the information will be used for, who will access the data once it's been recorded. The responses must be confidential. They will remain anonymous, for example, as one of the ethical requirements, so you need to mention that. They have to know that their participation in the research is voluntary. So there's a whole, depending on your code of ethics, there's a whole list of things that you should be covering under consent. But the fifth step is then to actually thank the participant before you start the interview for their time and for their effort, and give them a chance to ask questions. They might have not understood what the purpose is, or have a question about the recording and whether they will be identified and so on. We say anonymity, but not everyone even knows what that means and the extent to what their anonymity will be protected. So answer their questions before you proceed with the interview. And thank them for their time. Then doing the interview, uh, primarily there, we'll go into the detail of how to go about that, but the important thing is that all questions are asked and answered, and that you cover everything that you need to be covering. Then finishing the interview, uh, usually we repeat again how the data will be used. We thank the participant again, um, and we answer any questions that they might have. And then just to make sure, thanking them again for their time. So if you're required to manage this process of interviewing, it's like a juggling act. You have to manage the process at three levels. So first of all, the content level, you have to listen and you have to record information, whether that's audio recording or writing it down. Um, but the content has to be captured. And you have to listen the entire time that you are doing the interview. Um, the second level is to process the information. Um, you have to question, not only asking the questions. So you're managing the process in that you're not just asking the questions, you're also probing to find out more. You're also prompting. If the person, if you want the person to respond about specific aspects, you can prompt them about that. So all of that controls the direction of the interview and it encourages the person to actually share information with you. So managing the content, managing the process, and then lastly, managing the execution of the interview. And that's things like time control, assessing the energy and the attention of the person that you're having the conversation with, and moving the interview along. If you are if you see that you're running out of time or you are going to run out of time, but also even moving it along if you see that the person is getting tired. So execution and managing the execution of the process is also very important. But listening is the most important interviewing skill. And you can listen at two levels. So you can listen for the content, but and that's literally just what the person is saying. The type of listening tells you whether participants understand, or active listening, as we call it. It tells you whether the person understands what the question is, whether they're giving you information, and it's the information that you need, and whether they're giving you enough detail. And you can only know that if you are listening to the content. And this is the information that's recorded, whether it's recorded, written on a questionnaire, audio recorded, video recorded, whatever the person consented to, and whatever you need for your later analysis. But then there's also listening for unspoken information. And that unspoken information is often as important, if not more important in certain contexts, than listening for the straight up content. So how the participant is behaving and what they are not saying, for example, are things that fall under the unspoken information. Are they avoiding things? Are they contradicting what they are saying with what they are showing non-verbally? Um, and those are some of the signs that you should be watching out for. But I've got a practical way that is used quite widely, and I didn't misspell solar. I just thought for us to remember that it's solar, but it has an E and not an R. So five things. If you're trying to manage and and pay attention to the non-verbal behavior, which is a very important part of the interview. Um, Focus on five things, and that is your own, but also the participants' non-verbal behavior. So not just their non-verbal behavior, but also your own. And from your side, your attention needs to be on the following. So first of all, square on. So make sure that you're facing the person, that you're not turning away and talking away from them or even looking above them, that you are actually facing them square on. Um, Stand and sit facing them completely to show that you are paying attention. Secondly, have an open posture. So not whether you're standing or sitting doesn't matter. You need to be standing and sitting up straight, to show that you accept the information that's being shared with you. But don't hunch or cross your arms or your legs in front of you, that as people in the field of psychology, we should all know this, but you actually exclude the person or you push them away when you fold your arms or when you cross your legs. So an open posture. Thirdly, lean forward a little bit. So that the person sees that you're interested in what they're saying, um, and that you're involved in what the participant is saying. Don't lean into their face completely because that can appear threatening, but do lean forward, and you can actually use that as part of the dynamic to lean forward, lean back a bit, lean forward, lean back a bit, without making the person seasick, of course. Um, Fourthly, make eye contact. So make sure that you actually look the person in the eye and not talk to your notes instead of to the person. Remember, this is a conversation. So too little or too much eye contact. So don't stare at the person um, and not look away at all. So too little or too much eye contact will actually inhibit the person that you're having the conversation with. And most people are comfortable with about a meter between your eyes and theirs. So even if you're leaning in, don't lean in closer than that. But make eye contact and make sure that you manage the eye contact. And then fourthly, relax. Fifthly, sorry, relax. There's nothing like seeing someone doing an interview and sitting like this, or their face is contorted because they're anxious and nervous. Slow, smooth movement, calm facial expression, speak slower. Um, all of those things are indicative of relaxing nonverbal behavior. And when you relax, you will also see that the participant relax. So these things should hopefully be fairly familiar to all of you. Um, but a good way to remember it, solar, just spelt a little bit differently. So getting on to the how and the how not to do things, which I wanted to be the focus of today. Um, I'm going to start with how to ask great questions, because that especially in our field, the person who does the interview is also the person, often also the person who comes up with the questions. So in other fields, especially on the commercial side, it's separated. So you would have someone um, coming up with a questionnaire and then someone else doing an interview. But I'm going to assume for today that we also come up with the questions that we want to ask. What do you think is wrong with this question? The question being, why do you think GBV happens and whose fault is it?
We're getting a few of them come in from Fatima, Vic, and Tondani saying two questions in one. It's a double question.
And it's particularly leading. So it's kind of, it's already saying GBV is someone's fault. And it could potentially be quite judgmental. Definitely a double barrel question, as we call it. So there's kind of two questions in one, and the person will immediately go, well, which one do I answer first? Which one's more important? Forgetting the second half or forgetting the first half of the question and not answering both parts. It shifts the focus away from the participants' experiences and their perspective on the issue. And it actually asks them to answer the question as if they know what everyone else is thinking. So it's not a particularly good question. Um, in that same context, a better question, if you'll bear with me, it's a little bit longer, is asking something like, have you ever experienced or witnessed sexual harassment, physical assault, economic abuse, um, emotional abuse, or any other form of gender-based violence? And if the person says yes, they have, You can then follow up with, can you share the type of incidents and the context in which it happened? And you could even just define the context for them and ask whether it was, or probe whether it was workplace or home or a public space. So you can see from this question, it's specific, but it's open-ended enough to actually capture a whole range of experiences that someone might have had. And it provides examples of what constitutes gender-based violence to aid understanding. So not assuming that the person's going to know what GBV means and actually calling it by its name, by the full name, gender-based violence, but also giving examples of the things that could be included. And in this case, it's not leading to list those things because we want the person to be able to say yes or no to this. So the more things we can give as examples, the better. Um, this would typically be an introductory question and you would then go into the detail. But the most important thing, I think, is that it invites the participants to share the details that they feel comfortable sharing. So they could say, yes, I've experienced or witnessed this, um, but then they can say, I'm not happy to talk about it. And that's very important, and we'll get to that a bit later in terms of the ethics. So making sure that the person can share what so they can either share their own experience or they can share something they've witnessed if they're not comfortable sharing their own experience. But you're providing a safe environment for them to actually choose which of those they are willing to share with you. I've got a I always use this. This is kind of my checklist when I'm developing survey questions to make sure that I cover everything as it should be, and to make sure that the quality is what it should be. Um, the questions must be clear and they must be simple. Straightforward language that anyone can easily understand. No technical jargon, no complex terms, no ambiguous phrasing. So making sure that it's pitched at the level and in the language that the person that you are having the conversation with, the interview with, can actually understand. And you can be brief without being vague. So, for example, you can say, you can use how often instead of how regularly. Um, just be clear and use simple language. You have to be specific. Focus on one concept or issue at a time to avoid confusion and that kind of double barrel question that the first question or example was, that's a good way to create confusion so the person doesn't know what you're after and what information you need, and be precise about what you are asking without overwhelming the participant. So don't just rattle off a whole list of examples. Talk through it slowly, and don't overwhelm the person. Then make sure that your questions are relevant to your research objectives, and avoid questions that actually don't contribute meaningful data to the research that you're doing. Demographics are a good example. People have this list of standard demographics that they always ask, and not all of those are always relevant to the study that you're busy with. So actually go through the exercise of checking that each question actually has the potential to contribute information that's important to you in this specific research. Um, remain neutral. And I didn't want to say objective. We know we can never be objective, but as an interviewer, it is extremely important that you remain neutral. Neutral in the sense that you avoid leading or loaded questions, as we saw in the bad example, that might actually bias the responses of the person. So the person must actually feel comfortable saying anything at all, um, and avoid questions. Um, well, make sure that the questions align, um, that no one can kind of know, that no one knows this is what you think about it. We're not interested in what the interviewer thinks about the topic. We're interested in what the participant thinks about it. So they have to be encouraged to give honest answers. And as soon as we share our assumptions or our opinions, people who are being interviewed actually want to confirm that. So we're trying to avoid that, and so stay as neutral as possible. The moment that, and sometimes we don't stay neutral, as an example was given at the recent Congress by Peace, but that sometimes you get excited by an answer, or you get involved in what the person is saying, or you might even be triggered. And if that happens, we'll talk about how to deal with that. But the neutrality is gone, and then in a way you are moving from being the interviewer to being a participant, which is not a problem, but be aware of that neutrality. If you are an interviewer, the neutrality is very important. Um, be mindful of language and phrasing that might be offensive, or it might be inappropriate in either the social or the cultural context. So make sure that whatever you're asking is appropriate for the person sitting in front of you. And ensure that that your questions align with the lived reality of the person that you are interviewing, and with their experiences. And that's very tricky, especially if you don't have a person in mind. So very important before you start even developing the questions is knowing who it is that you want information from, because in market terms it's always called target audience, but this is your target participants, and you need to know who they are so that you know how to ask them questions and how to have conversations with them. Ultimately, the questions must be answerable. You can't ask someone something that they can't answer at all. And I'll give you an example of that. Um, if you if you ask someone how many beers they consumed in the month prior to the interview, very few people will be able to answer that, and they will probably give you nonsense because of recall. And the more beers you drink, the less you remember. So you will you will miss the opportunity to actually get information, because that question isn't really answerable. Um, be inclusive, so use language that accommodates diverse identities and experiences, and avoid assumptions. Any assumptions about gender, about roles, about relationships, just suspend those, because you will not be inclusive if you have those particular assumptions playing a role. Then include avoid questions that could actually, for example, re-traumatize participants, especially when you're discussing sensitive topics like the gender-based violence example I was using, and include an option for participants to skip questions, so that if they feel uncomfortable, they mustn't feel coerced to actually answer every single question. Um, Ask balanced and varied questions. So don't just ask closed-ended yes, no, and there's 30 of those questions. Combine things, balance it so that there are open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. There's nothing that gets a participant as withdrawn from the interaction with you as just a monotonous list of all the same types of questions. And then lastly, make sure that you test your questions with a few, just pilot it, test it with a few people to see whether you've missed anything, whether there's a word that people will find boggling, that they won't know, um, whether there's something that will offend someone in the target population that you're planning to interview. So make sure that you test it. Often we run out of time for testing, and so we tend to want to skip that point, but that is actually more important than most other things. I wanted to make a point about uh, oh, sorry, some examples. So the first one, at what age did you become sexually active? So there we are assuming, first of all, that this person is sexually active. And it's kind of a bombshell question to ask first. Um, the second example there, how many beers? I've mentioned that. That's expecting recall beyond what the over-enthusiastic beer drinker would be able to recall. Do you agree that personality is inherited? What are we doing there? We're leading the person to actually agree. Instead of asking, do you think that personality is inherited? Um, we're asking them to agree. So we're already leading them towards the direction in which we think they should be asking. Something like, do you drink regularly? Is particularly vague. It's an example of, it's a very vague question and it's probably unanswerable. Drink what? And what does regular mean? Way too vague for anyone to answer. And then the fifth one I used as an example to show how you can ask something that's not neutral. If you ask someone, do you think that killing babies by aborting them is wrong? There is already a whole emotion captured in the way that you're asking that question. So you are showing a bias and you are leading the person in terms of what you think they should be answering. Who wants to answer yes to killing babies? No one's going to answer that. If you are truly interested in whether the person is pro or against abortion, this is not the way to ask it. So our biases come into because interviewing is an interaction between an interviewer and between a participant, and often even more people. We have to be aware of bias. It's my bias, it's the participant's bias, and it's the people around us and their bias. Um, and bias, hopefully many of you will know this, but bias is any prejudice or preconceived ideas that can break that connection that you have with the participant and can negatively impact on the quality of the data. So on the one hand, interviewer bias is when me as an interviewer, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it doesn't matter, when I influence the research participants' answers during the data collection, and then I affect the validity and reliability of the data. So the biases in survey research specifically, this is not the same for all types of research. In survey research, it certainly is um, an important um, it's important to not have your biases impact negatively or positively on what the participant is sharing with you. So that's on the interviewer side, and there's a whole list of biases. I suggest you read up a bit on that. But things like questioning bias, the way that you ask the questions, the way that your non-verbal behavior influences the participant and so on. And then in terms of the participant side, so the participant, um, research participant bias occurs when the survey participant actually provides you inaccurate or untruthful answers for, again, for whatever reason. But that can also significantly impact the quality of the information that you get from them. And that can include things like social desirability, so they want to say what they think you want to hear. It also includes recall bias, the beer example I mentioned. So they want to answer you, but they don't really remember, but they'll give you an answer if you ask, because you're asking them, they will be answering you, and so on. So also again, a whole host of biases. But what I wanted to make sure we focus on is how to deal with bias and how to actually make sure that um, the bias, we can't prevent bias in its entirety. That would be unrealistic. But we can use strategies to mitigate for it. So one of the things, for example, is if we're guaranteeing anonymity, people are less likely to be biased, and are less likely to want to please you with the things that they're sharing with you. So if at all possible, make sure that anonymity is guaranteed. Randomizing questions help. Um, it helps things like demand characteristics, because it makes it harder for the participant to guess the purpose of the research. So asking questions in no particular order. And this is specifically survey research, again, not other research or not very qualitative research. And then lastly, clear and detailed instructions, and taking your time in that introduction to actually spend the time with the person, and make sure that they understand that you don't have expectations of them and want them to answer in a particular way, and that they should be absolutely truthful, and not responding. But if you find yourself, or the participant, if you find that there's bias creeping in, so for example, you can hear that they're just agreeing with everything, or they are looking at you and trying to suss out how you respond non-verbally before they give you their answer, or after they've given your answer before they give the next one. Um, a kind of a very practical strategy that I use that works well for me is I actually stop and I refocus my attention, and it takes a second or two. And it once you are comfortable that you can do that, it doesn't bother anyone if you just take a moment. Then make detailed notes about what you noticed, on your side and on the side of the participant in terms of bias. So what did you notice? At what point during the interview? Make a note of the time so that you can go back. So you don't want to stop the interview entirely. You just want to take a moment, but you also want to note that you picked up there was something going on, either with you or with the person that you're interviewing, because that information can be used when you're interpreting um, uh, uh, the data. Then correct your own behavior if it's your behavior. So if you went, take that away, just neutralize your face. So make sure that you correct your own behavior if that's needed. Listen carefully and record exactly what the participant says. So if you're feeling an emotional reaction, a visceral reaction, a bias coming up, make sure that you record exactly what the participant says without assuming what they are going to say, even or especially if you don't agree with what they are saying and what their opinions are. Make sure you record exactly what they're saying and not what you're hearing, but what they're saying. And lastly, re-engage the participant if needed. If they've shown bias, re-engage them, without accusing them of anything or being critical. So ask if they're comfortable or need a break. Remind them that there aren't any right or wrong answers. So make sure that their responses, that they know that their responses are okay. It doesn't matter what responses they give, it is okay. And that kind of the four steps for me normally sorts out any impact that bias has, or at least gives us a chance in the analysis to deal with it or to know how it impacted what we were doing. So there are lots of do's and don'ts, and I'm gonna post at the when we do Q&A in a few moments. I'm gonna post two links, one with a good interview and one with a bad interview. It's just two recordings on YouTube, and I have to apologize because they're very European and American. But those are the ones publicly available. Um, the most important thing, I think, is that we do research ethically, and our interviewing and in any other research, the four key principles for that for me is transparency. So making sure that um, the purpose of the research is known, that you're transparent about the information that you're collecting and why you're collecting it, and with who you're going to be sharing that information. Secondly, protecting the privacy of the person that you're interviewing, and also making sure that that they give consent, um, but protect them from third point, duty of care. Researchers must always behave ethically, and that includes us when we're interviewing and wearing our interviewing hat. And we mustn't do anything that will harm the person that we are interviewing, or that will damage the reputation of research. If I behave badly in an interview, the next time someone wants to do research and they want to interview someone, that person will say, no, thank you. Bad experience, not going there again. So anything that harms the reputation of research or that harms the person that you're doing the interview with should be avoided and should not be done at all. Remember when I said don't ask questions that would re-traumatize the person, make sure that they're safe and comfortable, all of those things. That is part of duty of care. And lastly, do not combine marketing with research. I know it's a pretty old-fashioned way of looking at things, but if you are combining marketing and research, you confuse the participant and you get really bad data. If I'm trying to sell you something and asking you questions about something, those are mixed purposes. And it's not only confusing to the participant, it actually harms the quality of your data. So make sure that you separate those two quite clearly. If you think, if you want to know, and this is just a bit of fun, if you want to know whether interviewing as a profession in itself is something you'd be interested in doing, there's a link in the presentation. You can take the quiz, and it'll give you a result. It's anonymous, so you don't have to put any details in, and it'll tell you whether you would be whether interviewing is the profession for you.
Leonie, again, thank you so much for this webinar. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for supporting us in 2024.